I play leadership bingo. Every meeting that I go into, I take a bingo card. And on that bingo card are 16 words and phrases like optics, socializing the document, incentivizing, giving 110%. You get the idea. And when I'm in these meetings, I take my big red texter, and whenever I hear the leader enunciate with great confidence one of these words and phrases, I simply tick it off my leadership bingo card. The old joke that we all remember is, why is this person calling a meeting? This meeting could have been an email. Well, I think the joke's moved on a bit now. We're looking at an email and we're saying, why has this email been sent? Why didn't that person simply have a personal thought bubble and keep it to themselves? So today, for our Global Listening Festival, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it, I want to share with you a slice of research that I've been working on for nearly a decade now. And this explores the notion of post-leadership. I want to explore how leadership and its attendant cliches are transforming our way of thinking about the world. Particularly, I want to think about how leadership is being used as a cliche. In fact, I have a very naughty argument that the more a human being talks about leadership, the less likely they are to exhibit their characteristics. And we have some research to enfold and shape my argument today from Jean Baudrillard. Jean Baudrillard predicted a very complicated way of thinking about leadership that he described as the double refusal. And he explored this concept in two of his important books, The Agony of Power and In the Shadow of the Silent Majorities. In these two books, Baudrillard investigated, quote, the end of the social, end of quote. So Baudrillard is really offering here a unique theorization of power, incorporating this double refusal, by which he means the sovereign's refusal to govern and the people's refusal to be governed. This double refusal provides a really interesting framework to think about the irrationality of our own time, the denial of power in our own time. So a leader cannot lead and the people refuse to be led. This is the double refusal. And in this space of ambivalence and anger and refusal exists my bingo card. The pointlessness of leadership at the moment, with all these bizarre phrases filling in that gap, filling in that space of the double refusal. So incentivizing, low-hanging fruit, disruption, endlessly disruption, and of course, socializing the document. So instead of filling up this space of the double refusal with banality, whether we're filling it with incompetence, whether we're filling it with confusion, my presentation today explores silence. Silence as a sorbet to create a post-leadership culture of meaning and of followership. You see, through this century, we've seen grotesque, horrendous, shameful moments. The racism, the xenophobia is simply too brutalizing, too dreadful. What's happened is the unsayable has not only become sayable, but normalized and banal. Semiotic violence is contagious. It's virulent and it's passionate in its banality. But this must not be normalized. This is not business as usual. Therefore, taking all these cliches and these buzzwords as not an elegant proxy for leadership, but instead as blocking leadership is the start of our project today. So my presentation for the Global Listening Festival summons and activates a key alternative. I want to explore how silence speaks. In Baudrillard's double refusal is silence. Our task today is to render that silence meaningful. So my presentation has two parts, silence, and we're looking at followership. Let's build something new. Let's build something meaningful today and together. And let's start with our first part, silence. Now, most of the emails I receive from colleagues and friends around the world these days are filled with fear, are filled with confusion, and yes, are filled with despair. We live in a time of irrationality, bizarre behaviours from leaders, reinforcing bizarre rules. What do we do today, right now, when there is no way to fight this power, where there is no way to fight the powerful? And the answer is silence. So let's start to think about today the power of silence by considering its alternative. We've all been there. We're in this meeting and all these third-rate randoms start to introduce themselves. They dominate meetings with their career narratives, taking up half the meeting simply talking about themselves. Now, this problem has increased in frequency in the last 10 years or so. But instead of people sort of moving around the table and introducing themselves, or the Zoom meeting and introducing themselves and going, "Hi, I'm Tara. How's it going?" Instead of doing the "Hi, hope everybody's well," what's now occurring is these third-rate randoms launch into this monologue, telling us all about how brilliant they are, how brilliant their career is, and how they're so much better than the rest of us. Now, of course, through this personal narrative occupying space, they actually prove the inverse. They show they are a minor person with a minor career in a minor organisation, and nobody actually cares. The truth of life is that the best people, the greatest scholars in the world, never pump themselves up, never talk about their achievements. They are quiet so that the work can speak for itself. But it's always difficult to know what to do in these situations where these randoms launch into their career narratives like they're Noam Chomsky at an anarcho-syndicalist conference. I now simply refuse to play this game. I sit in silence. I do not validate their nonsense. And I do not allow people to feel comfortable in their delusions. What silence can do is it can refocus and it can reorganize. Now, I know COVID particularly increased the visuality of our lives, but it's also increased the role of silence as resistance. Think about how many of those Teams meetings we went into, all the Skype, all the Zoom meetings, and we've experienced it where the screens are off. Everybody has their screens off and the microphones are off. These groups have completely disengaged. They are present, but they're not really present. They're disconnected and they're resisting through this disconnection. They're present, but they're absent. So digitization has enabled us to disconnect the visual at great ease. But what about sound? Our oral lives are different, very different from our visual lives. The cliche, seeing is believing, gives us a sense about how the eye and visuality dominates our time, dominates our present. But it also dominates how we learn, how we think. And what I'd like us to do is let's shake that up a little bit today. Let's think about our own personal and professional lives. How would our identity, How would our relationships transform if we focus on the information provided by our ears rather than our eyes? Now, after industrialization, after urbanization through the 19th century and the growth of cities, it is almost impossible to find and locate silence. Silence is rare. Actually, the right to silence is the greatest power that we have. When noise, when sound is everywhere, silence is a statement of power and it's a statement of authority. But silence remains defiant. Its power is clear. Its meaning is not. Sivaram Vermori in 2019 produced a powerful book titled Managing Silence in Workplaces. Every word in that title is significant. So for Vermori, he locates, quote, the cost of silence, quote, and, quote, the need to manage silence, end of quote. So silence is an obstruction for Vermori in managing a workplace. So for leaders, silence is a problem. So why did he make such an argument? He argues that silence kills, his word, kills inclusive workplaces, kills transformation, kills disruption, and kills innovation. Okay, so silence is a problem for workplaces. But Vermori has assigned a meaning to silence. Silence is detrimental to a workplace's productivity and efficiency. It is a proxy for a lack of workplace engagement. Vermori stated, quote, silence is itself a form of communication, end of quote. But the point I want to make now is that we are never clear or certain what the meaning of silence may be. Assumptions about our neoliberal workplace can no longer be generalized. All the attention in our workplace is granted to the loudest of people, those who voice their opinion, voice their self-importance. But how do we grant time? How do we grant meaning to people who are silent? And the answer is we don't. The answer is they are ignored. And there are tangible and intangible costs and consequences to this silence. Yes, employee turnover, burnout, quiet quitting, mental health concerns, litigation, obviously, and bullying. So this way of thinking about silence configures human beings as workers, human beings as the font of economic growth. We are resources for business. But we as humans, we are more than that. We are more than workers. Let me show you what I mean. When I was 18 years old, when, yes, dinosaurs roamed the earth, I read Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. How distinctive, how original it was. But I always held on to one paragraph from this remarkable novel. To be silent, to be alone, and this self, having shed its attachments, was free for the strangest adventures. So there is an ethics to silence, and ethical questions emerge from silence, particularly when we avoid defining silence prescriptively. And by that I mean silence is complex. Silence is diverse in its meaning, in its interpretations. Now, I know those in power claim silence and claim its meanings, so it gives silence a pejorative interpretation. But the point is, Silence is ignored. Silence is marginalized most of the time. Silence is only seen and heard if we pay attention to it. In other words, until we notice silence, it doesn't exist. As Bilas and Valmori have stated, quote, often silence is not noticed until it is too late, end of quote. So we don't place attention on silence. We don't place attention on those who are deploying silence. And that absence, that disconnection can create depression, resentment, anger, self-harm, seriously destructive working environments, suicide, and domestic violence. Our world is noisy. Fast communication, information silos, echo chambers, voter apathy, and a hardening of extreme viewpoints, right or left. Now, power operates through noise, through sound, through the voice. And most famously, think about how power and silence operate in our courts of law. Quote, silence in the court. What does that phrase mean? Silence must be controlled so that power can be confirmed through words. But this overt control suggests that silence is pervasive, it's unpredictable, and yes, it is troubling. Silence exists in spaces. And the thing is, silence exists in spaces that most of the time we do not know even exists. So our culture wants these nice, clean binaries, male, female, straight, gay, black, white. Good luck with that, right? But life is not like that. Meaning happens in the spaces. Silence happens in the spaces. And this act of recognizing and respecting silence is important for so many citizens, but particularly Indigenous citizens, First Peoples, and First Nations. Bilas and Valmori located 6 different types of silence: insolent silence, silence of hopelessness, silence of the oppressed, silence of fear, silence for attentive listening, and silence which makes place and space for dialogue. Now, you'll notice significantly in these categories, they left out silence and resistance. Silence as resistance. This resistance can be used to hold ground, to hold a position, to not give approval to a person or a position or an idea. So silence can be a coping strategy in our present. But in our present lives, our working lives, our professional lives, our personal lives, it requires a different type of refusal now. This is a refusal to participate. This refusal to participate offers a pause, a way to heal, a way to find alternative pathways, alternative trajectories to the future. As Hall, Korobayas, and Kishenbaum have confirmed, communication is situational, but quietness is important in these situations. And if you think about it, language determines how we see, frame, and shape our thinking about the world. We speak our reality. Silence, though, is different in its configuration of social relationships. We use speech to create, maintain, and transform our interpersonal relationships. But silence also offers a role in the maintenance or indeed the destruction of personal relationships. Silence can also be refusal, a way to avoid conflict, a way to avoid pain, avoid trauma. Think about the phrase silent treatment. Yeah, this is a way to respond to antagonism. Silence is a way to hold a moment, hold a relationship in stasis until we as individuals have worked out what is going on. Silence, of course, also has a critique. It is a statement that an individual refuses to participate. So silence is an act of refusal. So when our experience transcends speech, we have to activate the word of silence and the world of silence. Maggie Ross described, quote, the simmering conflict between hierarchy and silence, end of quote. You see, speech is valued. Silence is suppressed. So what we need, therefore, is to enable what Schaefer described as, quote, the recovery of positive silence, end of quote. Raymond Murray Schaefer died on August 14, 2021. So as we're approaching the anniversary of his death, it seems so important to reclaim some of his power and meaning. Born in 1933, he moved the mind furniture of multiple scholarly generations through his World Soundscapes project. Studying soundscapes allows us to think about how a place is revealed to us. Schaefer, a writer, a composer, he was interested in sonic ecology, the relationship between the maker of a sound and the sound itself. And he called for experimental music or ear cleaning, and his key trope and project was the development of a thinking ear. So for those of us who learn, those of us who work in universities, we are what Schaefer describes as, quote, ear witnesses, end of quote, to the changing relationships between information and knowledge, teaching and research, research and ignorance, and social justice and neoliberalism. We do not yet possess the sonic literacy to interpret fear, redundancy, and loss through restructure after restructure after restructure, as our colleagues are discarded, as their expertise is marginalised. We hear the decades of injustice masking sexual assault and sexual harassment in our universities. And we see and we hear the multiple research code of conduct breaches, research misconduct breaches, as people who have done nothing to contribute to research have been added as authors. We watch, we listen, we know. But if we listen with consciousness, if we summon that thinking ear, if we recognize the sound marks of our time, then we can create space for resistance, refusal, and change. For those of us who are sick of fighting, sick of listening to nonsense, sick of having to listen to people without any expertise, sick of listening to irrationality day after day after day, silence offers us a pause for reflection, a pause to enable a restart. We are not offering compliance or support to people who do not deserve compliance or support. At a time when talking, when conversation, when dialogue is no longer possible, it's no longer respected, the restraint of silence is meaningful. It grants us a chance to assemble a different trajectory, to build a different future. And this different future is not about leadership and its loud cliches on my bingo card. This is about followership and meaningful silence. My second section. I've been reading very strongly about alternatives to leadership and indeed alternatives to leadership training. There is no doubt that leadership is everywhere and courses about leadership are everywhere. Everyone's a leader, and if they're not a leader, they're on a waiting list for leadership training. But leadership certainly is an issue. Leadership certainly is a problem. But leadership is not an identity. It is a set of behaviours, a set of practices. It is a vocabulary. Leadership, therefore, must be a pathway to something. To have a leader is to have followers, and therefore we require a very strong theorisation of followership. Any leadership goal, mission, or value depends on the noun that's very popular at a particular time, but that vision or that vista must be shared with followers. It must be believed by followers, or else nothing actually happens. We've lived through much of this century, and if there's a characteristic of much of this century, it is a failure of leadership. So followers didn't follow. Nothing got done. Nothing changed. And of course, we've lost that commitment, that belief in the public good, public education, public health, public libraries. We've lost that working together for productive change. So let's talk about followership. This is a small literature, but it may just be integral to creating a better future. Now, even when followership is talked about in the literature, invariably it's discussed through the lens of leadership. So in this little bit of my presentation, I'd like us to disconnect these words, at least for a time. The word followership isn't used that often in the leadership literature because other words are deployed, like employees, hired help, the staff, workers. Workplaces are dominated by followers, not leaders. Yet leadership training remains the focus. And the word followership sort of has a weird ring to it, like it's come from Tolkien. Most of us, most of the time, have to do what other people tell us to do. And yet this organisational culture operates or collapses, it shrinks and it dies on the basis of followership. But no, we don't talk about followership. Instead, we think, oh, if we can just get the leadership right, if we can just get the leadership of this organisation right, then we're going to be successful. Well, I think we know after what we've seen in this century, that's a flawed premise. We've seen how wrong it is, and we see how damaging it is. So when we think of followers, as Brown and Thornborough have shown in this very early article in the 1990s, we tend to think of passivity, low status, a lack of responsibility, sheep, people who are alienated. Now, instead, I'm arguing for the importance of followership, which requires the silence of leadership and listening to alternatives, trajectories, and pathways. Followers are active. Followership emerges through the result of a series of decisions. And these decisions emerge through listening. Powerfully, Brown and Thornborough stated that, quote, organisations do get the followers that they deserve, end of quote. Therefore, If followership is neglected, there will be consequences. If followers are only understood or studied in relation to leadership, it will restrict and truncate the very understanding of work, the very understanding of achievement, and indeed how we organise our lives. Robert Kelly is a great international leader in followership, emerging particularly through his great book, The Power of Followership. With followership added to an organisational vocabulary, the focus is on independent, active, critical thinkers who build teams, who build innovative collaborations and achieve shared goals. Now, James Mardosis really provided, I think, the key skill set for followers. Response abilities, brilliant. Responsibilities, 2 words. To possess the ability to respond to an event, a crisis, a necessity, a mission, a goal, whatever phrase is trendy at the time. Followership, therefore, captures an openness to learning, an openness to newness, to innovation, to share knowledge about the job. Reciprocal collaboration. There it is. So the capacity of followers to adapt and build partnerships and collaborations at speed, they are the key skills of our time. Deep thinking has taken place, and this deep thinking is based on active listening, reflecting on the views and the approaches of others in silence. We are building citizenship, not building hierarchies. Adaptability, therefore, is the crucial skill because of digitisation, accelerated modernity, globalisation, whatever you like. But no leader can manage the speed of change, and no leader can manage the speed of decision making. So the capacity of followers to adapt, to build partnerships at skill, there it is. That will create the instrument for change. The consequences of not understanding followership, to be frank, we've seen because we're living it. It's our present. We live in a present of toxic and brittle leaders who create disconnected, disrespected followers who show up to get paid but have no interest in starting their working day or finishing their working day. They simply front because they have to get paid. The assumption now, though, is that a person has a destiny to be a leader. We have people who are born to lead, strong, confident, aggressive. Now, the world is filled with these people, and their confidence is actually overconfidence, and their strength is actually bullying, and their aggression is actually toxic. And the notion that these people were born to lead, well, that reinforces historic injustices based on colonisation, misogyny, ageism. If there is a reason why our leadership is in such a poor state at the moment, it's because we've had a lack of attention on followership. And we have particular tropes of a follower-centric organisation. A communication context of honesty, self-awareness of strengths and limitations, empathy, organisational transparency, but also the development of a thinking ear. Any diversity that exists in an organisation exists in the followers, not in the leadership. So when we place attention on followers, we all start as citizens, as much as scholars, to understand what's gone wrong, so very wrong in this century. There is another way. And as Albin, Riggio, Lowe and Carsten have confirmed, they argue it's time that we move away from a leader-centric organisation and move to follower-centric organisations. So what this phrase means, and hang on to yourself, it's brilliant, is that followers actually create leaders. not the other way around. So without followership, leadership doesn't exist. It's constructed through the followers. So the legendary Barbara Kellerman configured a taxonomy for followers. She found the isolates, they are detached, they're not hugely interested in leaders or leadership, they're not hugely interested in responses of any kind. But then we have the bystanders who observe, might participate a bit, but mainly observe, and they make quite conscious decisions to disconnect. Then, of course, we have the participants who are engaged, but they either agree or disagree with the leader, but they do invest time and energy to make an impact, but that impact may be good or ill. Then we have the final two categories are brilliant. The activists, they are eager, they are energetic, they are engaged, and they're heavily invested in people and processes and resources. Now, this group can work incredibly well for leaders, or indeed they can undermine them at every turn. Then we have the diehards. These are the people who are prepared to die in a ditch for their views. They can be absolutely devoted to a leader, or they will cut their head off at the first opportunity. So their life is particularly consumed by their views, their perspective. Now, I'm sure we can all recognize either ourselves or our friends and colleagues in that taxonomy. But how do we create a followership community beyond these characteristics? How do we create a better organisational culture and indeed create a better society? Well, when we place attention on followers and followership, we as researchers, we as citizens have a brand new way to understand why particular outcomes emerge. You see, a follower is not lesser to leadership. They're not passive. It's not a preparation for leadership. It's not a way, and I'm going to use that dreadful phrase, followership is not a way to manage up, my goodness me, and it's also not exclusive of leadership, because the best leaders are actually followers, focusing on the horizontal relationships and collaborations in their lives. So followership is a great way to think about power distribution, a way to think about work, particularly what is meaningful work in an organisation. And of course, it's the way to create an inclusive workforce. For me, though, it's also a way to diagnose incompetent leadership and explore what incompetence looks like. And it's a way to move discussions of leadership beyond personal ambition. Now, Karuna Shankar Pandey stated that followers create, and I love this, followers create executable power. Brilliant. Power, of course, in and of itself does little except to create fear and disconnection, but executable power demonstrates the importance of listening and thinking, and the importance of building relationships and communication systems between listening and thinking. What exists in the space between learning and thinking? Brilliant. Now, we've talked about the Baudrillard-inspired double refusal, and that really is the frame for my presentation today. The refusal to lead and the refusal to be led. Dreadful people in positions of power who have no idea what they're doing and fill the space between themselves and their followers with my bingo card. All those cliches, all those assumptions, these meaningful phrases fill out the space between leadership and followership. And because these leaders are incompetent, followers turn away from them. They disconnect, often in disgust. Most of us as citizens disconnect from our leaders because we do not trust them. They are not credible. They are brittle. And they don't know what they're doing. This situation of weak leaders is made even worse because weak leaders put weak followers around them. Peter Principle 101. And therefore, to make a change in this absolutely disastrous situation requires us to get out of the double refusal. How are we going to get out of the double refusal and make changes in our lives? Well, Kurt Madden described the way out as the formulation of the synergetic follower. We therefore must live lives of honesty, integrity, dignity, listening, learning, and reflection. We have to be courageous, and courageous through our collaborations. Let's think about the models of leadership that are taught in our leadership training programs at the moment. Transactional leadership, transformational leadership, charismatic leadership, and even authentic leadership, right? Authentic leadership. Read some appalling dissertations, can I say, PhD dissertations using authentic leadership, and what the authenticity is now referring to as the leader expressing their identity, telling followers about themselves in even more granular detail, like a data point of one is actually meaningful. That supposedly is authenticity now. But of course, what is left out, and what I would argue is the only interventionist model of leadership that exists, is the undiscussed star of leadership theory, which comes from Robert Greenleaf from the 1970s, and his model of servant leadership. To be a servant, we must listen, reflect, mirror, verify, confirm, and critique. To be a servant leader, we most importantly must care. We often talk about being active, speaking up, being courageous. But I think my presentation today stands for something else. To summon the activity, the actions of listening, learning, and silence. It is a time for respect and reflection, listening and learning, followership and fearlessness. We have to remember that the choices that we make today, the choices that we make every day, matter. Now, I was thinking about the Birds song from the great film Easy Rider, Wasn't Born to Follow. Great track, can I say? Great track. But no one is born to follow, just like no one is born to lead. We are made, not born. And what we're made for is to make meaning. And it seems appropriate to not finish with the Birds, but the man who wrote some of their hits, and indeed sung with Roger McGuinn at times. Let's finish with Bob Dylan. All of us gotta serve somebody. But you know what? We get to choose who we serve. Thank you for your time.